This is episode number 154 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking once again with James Stejskal. James enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1973 and served for more than 20 years, including with the now famous Special Forces Detachment A in Berlin in the 1970s and 80s, among many other assignments. He was severely wounded in Somalia in 1992 and medically retired from the Army in 1996, after which he joined the CIA as a case officer, where he spent nearly another 15 years. Now fully retired from government service, James has written several nonfiction books as well as a new series of novels called The Snakeeater Chronicles. James was my guest for episode number 98 of the podcast over a year ago, so if you haven't heard that one already, you won't want to miss it. I invited him back today after reading his newest book, Mission Iran, which is available now. It's the story of the role Detachment A played in Operation Eagle Claw to rescue American hostages in Tehran in 1980. Although Eagle Claw is a very well-known historic event, Detachment A's part has never been known in detail until James wrote Mission Iran. This episode is sponsored by Grayman & Company, who I always love working with. Grayman & Company make bespoke custom suits with tons of features for those who need to carry for the fight while looking impeccably tailored. They recently opened an atelier just off Savile Row in London. If James Bond were real, he'd be wearing a Grayman & Company suit. They also make unique peak-textured merino wool polo shirts that are versatile and perfect for traveling. These polos are great for casual wear, but also feature a real shirt collar and long placket, making them business appropriate as well. If you prefer to travel light like I do, then this is the one and only shirt you need. Grayman & Company also offer a lineup of impact-resistant Wayfarer sunglasses with lens technology that you really have to see through to believe. I have a pair of their acetate aviator sunglasses, which are my primary pair that go everywhere with me. The clarity and scratch resistance is unlike anything you can find on the mass market. They're very stylish too, so no one will think you're wearing eye protection. This whole brand was made for guys who want to look good and keep a low profile, but stay protected and capable no matter what. Find them at grayman.co and make sure to follow them on Instagram at grayman.company. James, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Justin. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really glad to be here as well. I know that since we last talked, you've been very busy finishing this book, and I think that you even hinted at it last year, so I was really happy to get my hands on it a few weeks ago because it really is just such an incredible story.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. It's always pretty important to hear for an author, so it's a good thing to hear.
Good. No worries there, I promise. So, this is a topic that is decades old, but it's hardly been written about until now in this level of detail. So, did you find it difficult to get any sort of like official clearance to actually write about this subject in detail?
Well, I wrote my other history, Special Forces Berlin, and I talked about the mission to some extent, and that was 8 years ago. And that book took 16 months to get government clearance. So I fully expected that I would not get very much pushback on this, but despite all that, the government took another year to clear this book. So that
Oh
actually
man.
pushed us back on the publication date a bit. So that was kind of
Ah,
frustrating. It wasn't that difficult to write. I have been talking to a lot of the participants, my member cadre, my colleagues, I should say, who were involved with the operation. So that part was fairly simple, but getting it through the government, that's always a challenge.
yeah, that goes for a lot more than just publishing books like this, I'm certain, but it's quite a bottleneck in so many ways, unfortunately. But we do have the finished product available now, which I'm very glad about because I feel like it was certainly worth the wait.
Well, I think so. As you said, there's been a lot of history put out there about what the other elements did. The Air Force, of course, the unit I am not supposed to name because the government keeps redacting it out of my book that happens to be stationed at Fort Bragg, and a lot of the other people. But Detachment A's contribution was barely mentioned at all before. So this for me and for my colleagues, my comrades, was very important to get out so the families knew what they had undertaken.
Yeah, certainly. And undertaken is a good word because it was quite an undertaking, as is clear from the book. So, for the listeners who have not already heard our previous episode or have not read your first book, can you talk a little bit about how Det A differed from other assignments within Army Special Forces as a whole?
Well, Detachment A was a special forces unit, much like many of the other special forces units around the world, with one exception. We were stationed in West Berlin, which was deep inside communist East Germany at the time. And the mission there was, in case of war, to be prepared to go underground, to be a stay behind unit, basically to harass the Warsaw Pact forces and make it more difficult for them to go forward to attack West Germany and the rest of NATO. We were basically there to throw ourselves on the track and try to stop the train, is what it was. So it was. Some people have called it a suicide mission. Luckily, we never had to exercise it, but that was our primary mission when the unit was established in 1956, all the way up until it closed down in 1990.
Man, yeah, I guess that on a daily basis, while you were assigned to that detachment, you were about as up close and personal with the enemy as you could be in a outside of like a actual combat zone, right? Or outside of a declared war zone, anyway.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the Russians and the East Germans surrounded us, and they had a fairly significant manpower advantage. The Allied forces in West Berlin consisted of the French, which were about 12 to 15,000 troops, the British, which were about the same, 15,000, and then the Americans, which were about 20,000.
Hmm.
Detachment A was a pretty small component of that, between 100 and 120 men, 6 A teams. But we figured the odds were pretty good because outside the city, there were only about 350,000 East German troops and somewhere between 350 and 500,000. Some estimates have gone as high as a million Soviet troops. So, yeah, we figured the odds were pretty good.
My goodness. So I can understand why people might consider it a suicide assignment, but you still were able to attract kind of the best and the brightest among special forces soldiers already, right? It was probably no other place to get that kind of experience and that kind of potential impact on a coming war.
That is exactly the point, and the people that join special forces don't join it to find an easy, cushy place to go. They're looking constantly looking for the next best deal, and the
Hmm.
best deal during that time was to go to Berlin. Yeah, the prospects of what would happen during war was out there, but I think the guys that went to Vietnam, the guys that went to El Salvador, they thought the same thing. They were looking to do their job in the face of an enemy, and that's exactly
Hmm.
what we were there for.
Certainly, certainly. Can you talk a little bit about this Red Sails exercise you mentioned in the book? It took place in 1978, I believe.
It took place a couple of different times, actually.
Oh, okay.
As I said, we were preparing in case of war to go underground, and that to do stay behind operations. And that entailed basically hiding from the bad guys. We took a lot of the tricks of the trade from the Office of Strategic Services that operated in World War II, the British Special Operations Executive. We received a lot of training from the Central Intelligence Agency on urban tradecraft. And then we expanded on that, and we were constantly working on that kind of training. Basically, what we were doing was training to be terrorists in hostile territory. And it's the same old adage, if you want to counter them, you have to think like them and train like them. And that's what we did. So we
Hmm.
trained to be basically a clandestine terrorist organization that would try to give the Russians as much grief as possible. This Red
Hmm.
Sails operation was conceived by the British. They wanted to test their own systems in the United Kingdom, and they asked the United States whether or not we could provide some forces to go against their best MI5 and MI6. So it came down through channels, and we sent several teams to England, basically to portray what an Irish Republican Army terrorist group might look like inside the UK. So we were sending people in, 4-man teams with taskings to strike targets in the UK, simulated, of course. but all choreographed by the British intelligence service. And it was quite good training for the British, and it was quite good training for us. But there's no other unit in the U.S. Army, actually the U.S. Armed Forces, that was trained to do both of those operations. Yeah, we have military intelligence people that go undercover, but we really didn't have any special forces, commando types who could do both operations. To work undercover as a terrorist cell in a foreign country using contrived documentation. In other words, you were under false names and false passports, and try to go in and actually strike a target and escape without being caught. That's what the exercise was about. I think we did it 4 times, and each time it was successful.
Hmm. Fantastic. And so, as I understand it, as it turns out, that proved to be extremely useful training once this mission came up in Tehran rather than in Western Europe.
Exactly. One of the other skills you learn in special forces is target analysis, how to look at a target and figure out the best way and the most efficient way to go in and either take it out or bring it out. So those kind of skills came into play when they were looking for people to help on the Iran mission.
Hmm. Fantastic. So, you guys were in the right place at the right time with the right training and everything in that case.
It seems to be, yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. So, can you talk about, since we already mentioned Iran, obviously, how exactly did the situation in Tehran evolve to the point where the personnel at the U.S. embassy were in actual danger from the citizens of Iran or the groups inside of Iran? Like, what was the breakdown of civil authority, national security, that sort of thing that led to this hostage crisis?
Well, I think it was a classic case of revolution in the country. The Shah of Iran had been in power since the 1950s, ironically put in place by the British and the Americans during another coup d'etat. But the people basically were tired of the Shah's extravagance, his overuse of power. They did not like the Shah's intelligence service, which more and more was repressive. And there were outside influences, one of whom was the Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious figure who garnered enough support inside the country to start a revolution, a rebellion against the government. And it took about 2 years, but it was an underground movement that quickly became very much in the foreground. And the Shah of Iran was forced out of the country. The United States was basically backpedaling the entire time. The Ayatollah Khomeini named the United States as one of his principal antagonists. And slowly, over the period of about a year, the demonstrations got more and more hostile towards the United States until the embassy was taken over on the 4th of November, 1979.
Hmm. Do you happen to know, was that situation foreseen, like, as a worst case scenario at all? Because I mean, nobody was evacuated, I guess, up leading up until the actual hostage taking, were they? I mean, was just like a brand new, totally unexpected thing that occurred?
It was very much. I mean, there were predictions that it could be there could be a full scale rebellion and revolt, which actually did happen. And several Americans had been captured and taken hostage by the religious groups before that. But I do not believe that anyone in the embassy predicted that the embassy would be assaulted
Hmm.
and taken.
Okay. So how did the personnel within Det A find out all of this was going on and then find out that they might be involved with any potential rescue operation?
Well, when the country started to go down the hill, the unit had been tasked to do security surveys inside Iran. We had several
Oh.
people that had good knowledge of the country, had been there, and we were actually looking at trying to safeguard some American assets inside the country. That mission had been called off because the situation had degraded so fast. But when the hostage situation came up, the unit was quickly identified as one of the only units that had any kind of experience at knowing what the target looked like. And so the unit was selected primarily for its intelligence collection activities at that time.
Okay, I see. So this wasn't foreseen at the beginning as a rescue effort. In that case, it was try and get in and find out what the picture is on the ground.
The planning for the rescue effort began within hours after the embassy was taken. That much is clear.
Okay,
What
I gotcha.
Detachment A's part of the plan initially was intelligence collection only. And that quickly changed later on when Charlie Beckwith said that he had enough people to do one part of the operation, but not the other. And that's when our commander said, we can handle the other half because the unit had been training for counterterrorism. Actually, Detachment A became the first military counterterrorist unit in 1975. We had begun training because the commander of US forces in Europe had seen what was going on in places like Munich and with the Israelis, with all the bombings and terrorist incidents that were going on in Europe. So the unit was designated as the European counterterrorist team.
Okay, okay, I see.
Along with the stay behind mission, the unit had picked up a secondary mission of counterterrorism. And so we had been training on basically the same stuff that all the other units were doing, the British Special Air Service, the German GSG 9, the Israeli commandos. So our training was up to snuff, and our colonel knew that we could handle that part of the mission. Charlie Beckwith accepted that fact, and so did General Vaught, who was the overall commander of the rescue attempt. So the unit got quickly brought in to not only do the advance force preparation, that is, going in and finding out the intelligence needed to conduct this rescue operation, but also to prepare to do a takedown of a building and the removal of several people to bring them back to the States.
Mm, okay, I've got you. So I understand. I mean, it should be clear that there were some incredible difficulties that were very obvious right from the beginning of the planning stages with actually pulling off something like this. So can you talk about what difficulties were encountered and how you worked to overcome any of those?
Well, the primary difficulties in the entire operation was delivering the assault force into Tehran. The distances to be covered were basically more than any kind of commando raid, assault force raid had ever experienced before. We had done a similar operation in Vietnam with the Sante raid, but
Hmm.
the miles involved, the aircraft that were involved, were all capable of handling these distances. Flying overland into Tehran was a formidable challenge. And the only way that they could figure out how to do it was to get helicopters onto an aircraft carrier and into the Indian Ocean to undertake that. I mean, you can deliver people by aircraft into a city by parachute, but you can't land an airplane close to the target. So the
Right.
the teams had to be infiltrated into the city undercover, and then the plan was for them to be picked up by a helicopter and pulled out. Part of the problem was that the force was cut down to the very bare minimum, partially by the military, partially by President Carter. So the overall difficulty was really getting in to the country and then getting out. The actual target itself would have been formidable objective, but that was relatively easy compared to the difficulty of getting basically 130 people into a foreign capital 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly place.
My gosh. Yeah, it's certainly very hard to imagine doing that and getting everybody out again. And I'm curious. I know that the revolution had occurred recently, but were the new revolutionary forces like how formidable were they? Were they well organized and well equipped and ready for something similar to this, or were they kind of ragtag, unpredictable, etc.?
It was assessed that it would be sort of a combination. The
Mm,
people that were on holding the hostages at the American embassy and the Iranian foreign ministry were assessed to be revolutionaries. Some of them trained, most of them not so much. I mean, they were equipped with decent weapons, but that part of it was not seen as anything that could not be overcome. Yeah, you're going to have people shooting back at you, but it wasn't going to be that bad. What they did have, what the Iranians did have, was military units that were outside the city or some inside the city that could act as reaction forces. That necessitated getting in quietly and without being noticed and then being taken out very quickly. The plan was to have overhead cover to actually provide air support, gunfire support, should it be necessary, but it was hoped that we could get in and get out quickly without them reacting. The
Hmm.
Iranians also had radars on the ground, so the aircraft had to conduct certain operations to minimize the possibility of detection as they flew into the country. And as it turned out, they did get in and out of the country without being detected.
Hmm. Man, still, I mean, it sounds like you're mitigating a lot of these concerns, but it was still going to be just a incredibly risky operation in so many different ways. So, what was Det A's role in all of this? Because you're a much smaller organization than the other one, than Charlie Beckwith's unit, for example.
Well, initially, as I said, the mission was to go in and find intelligence. How to get into the target? What did the target look like? What were the streets involved? Who was there? And the only way you can really do that well is to put somebody on the ground to go look at it. Two guys, well, actually, five guys from Detachment A were initially considered. They were considered because they were foreign nationals originally. They were American citizens now, but they were born overseas and they could be given a cover identity, much like Jason Bourne, only better, to go into the country and collect the intelligence that was needed. And you couldn't really send just a CIA agent or maybe a military intelligence guy because they had to know the military aspects of what was being planned, how to collect the information for that. So in the end, two guys from Detachment A were chosen, and they went into the country twice to collect information. They went in under commercial cover as businessmen, and they were able to surveil, to look at, to collect intelligence on the two targets, how to get in and out, locations for where the helicopters could land, made sure those were okay, and also to set up vehicles so that they could bring the entire assault force from outside the city into the city. So that was an extremely ambitious mission for them, but they pulled it off successfully.
Hmm. Yeah, that's incredible. So just two guys basically going in and having to rely on themselves and nothing else because there were no other real assets or anything in place. Like there's no chance of rescue or anything like that. I take it when these two guys are the first ones going in.
They were basically on their own. The agency, the CIA, I should say, told the Army that they had no assets available to work in the country. They had nothing available. It wasn't quite true because they put in one asset who helped acquire vehicles and a warehouse to put them in. He did that, turned it over to our people, and then got out of the country. He did that successfully. So
Hmm.
that was another success by the CIA. Our guys went in, did the reconnaissance, had to completely set up the warehouse and then do the mission or the surveillance, I should say, to find out how to take their vehicles from that warehouse out to where the helicopter landing zone was, which was miles outside the city, so that they could pick up the people and bring them out. They did all that preparation, left the country, and then came back into the country just before the operation was planned.
Okay, I see. And all of this they're doing just under this commercial cover, like they're just renting warehouse space from someone who's totally oblivious to the true purpose. I take it they're just, a businessman doing business as far as everyone that they come into contact with is concerned.
Absolutely. One guy was dealing in a commodity and the other guy was a real estate person.
Okay, okay, gotcha. Very cool. So after they come out, did these same two guys have to go back later on, or was there another team that went in later on?
Well, The same team went back in. They were the ones who really knew what was happening, so they went back in
Right.
to receive the assault force and bring them into the targets. They were augmented by two additional people. One guy was an Iranian national, now an American citizen, but he spoke fluent Farsi. He came in, his name was Fred, and then he came in with another guy by the name of Richard Meadows, who was actually a civilian, but he was an advisor to Charlie Beckwith. So he came in as well. So now you've got four people on the ground inside the city, and they're waiting for D-Day, the day when the American forces arrive.
Hmm. So, does anything that they're doing while they're in country, is it raising any sort of alarm or causing any concern at all? Because I have to assume that there's a lot of tension right then with like security forces, police forces inside of Tehran with the embassy situation.
Well, luckily, it appears that the security force were kind of oblivious to the fact that the Americans might send in a commando team.
Hmm.
Yeah, you've got foreigners who are still working in the country. You've got the diplomats from many countries who are still present there. The British were still there. The Canadians had left. The Swiss were still there. A number of embassies. And you still have business people coming in from various countries. So our guys were working under the assumption that as long as they didn't break that cover and do something stupid, then they wouldn't have a problem.
Okay.
That only changed on one event when they got stopped by the police, four of them in a car, and our hero of the day, the mad German, who was one of our guys that had been sent in at the beginning, was driving, but unfortunately, one of the other teammates had placed his briefcase in the trunk of the car. That wouldn't have been a problem, except exposed in the trunk of the car was a satellite radio. So he had to get
Hmm.
out of the car, open the trunk, get his briefcase and his license out without the police seeing that. So, according to the mad German, Clem, he put on quite a theatrical performance in order to make that happen. But luckily he did, and they were able to be released by the police with only a ticket and a citation that they were supposed to pay at the airport before they left. Clem says he still has that ticket in his war room in his basement.
Wow. Wow, that is incredible. That must have been a horribly tense moment for those guys, even if the policeman was not necessarily expecting to find anything in the trunk of the car at that time.
I
Man.
think that's probably the understatement of this
Yeah.
entire conversation.
Wow. Wow. So, as I understand it, besides at the embassy, there were also a few hostages held elsewhere, and that kind of became Det A's responsibility, right?
That was the part that Charlie said he could not handle. About a mile away from the embassy compound, which was a very large compound, about 23 acres, with a number of buildings that had to be searched and the hostages pulled out. Charlie Beckwith had 90 people to do that, and that's about all he had that were fully trained at the time. So Detachment A was given the mission for the other three hostages that were being held at the Iranian Foreign Ministry about a mile away. So they were tasked to do that, and our cut was initially 11 people, but that was cut down to 9 total people to do that. So they had that as their mission, and that's what we were training for back in the city while everybody else was in the States practicing for the embassy.
Okay, so you would have to the 9 members that you talk about, they would have to like peel off from the main force, go get these hostages and bring them back, or was there like a totally separate infiltration, exfiltration kind of plan going on?
The plan was for them to go in, and they did. They went into Desert One with the forces, with Charlie Beckwith's forces. There was also a Ranger unit that was on the aircraft, and their mission was to secure the landing zone while the aircraft came in and unloaded the troops. And it was there that they would meet the helicopters and fly on. So they would move to a second landing zone and then go into the city, and only when they got to the edge of the city would they bifurcate, would they split, and Charlie Beckwith's troops would go to the embassy, and the Det A guys would head for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where the other three hostages were held.
Okay, I see. Did that plan involve any subterfuge or cover or anything, or was it just like move fast and shoot everybody that looks at you, kind of?
They were moving, they would have been moving in commercial vehicles about the size of the Mercedes or Dodge Sprinter vans that would each hold about 20 people, and they would move as civilian vehicles into the city. Again, heavily armed at that point, but hopefully they wouldn't run into any roadblocks.
Hmm. I've got you. So as it actually takes place, everyone eventually moves to Desert One, and I think most of the listeners certainly know what happened there. But can you kind of briefly go over that for anyone who's hearing it now for the first time?
Well, getting the troops into Desert One by C-130 Hercules and additional refueling aircraft went off without a hitch. They got there on time. Troops offloaded. Everything was ready for the arrival of 6 helicopters that had launched off an aircraft carrier. The helicopters, unfortunately, for a number of reasons, had issues. Ended up that one helicopter turned back, one was abandoned, and on arrival at Desert One, another helicopter had a hydraulics failure. So they basically did not have enough aircraft to continue the mission, and the mission was aborted. Theoretically, the mission could have happened again the next night or 2 nights, but in the act of refueling the helicopters to get back out of there, one of the helicopters, the pilots were blinded by the sand that was blowing up their rotors, and it drifted into a C-130, caused a collision, and 8 people were killed in that conflagration. The force exfiltrated, but the mission was basically over at that point. They knew the Iranians would figure out what happened, and so they knew that the mission would probably not happen again, at least for a foreseeable future.
Okay, I see. That is horribly tragic and unfortunate for everyone involved. Was there an expectation that another mission would take place like immediately, like within days or weeks, or was it like we're going to have to rethink all of this and see how we're going to move forward?
Well, once things settled down a bit back in the States, it was obviously several days before the news had fully sunken in. There was a renewed effort to plan a rescue mission because the problem still existed. The Iranians were not going to release the hostages. The immediate concern, though, was for the 4 guys that were still in Tehran
Right, right.
because they didn't know what happened at Desert One, at least not initially. And
Oh
then
wow.
some idiot, excuse my French, but I could use a stronger word, in the Pentagon gave a background briefing that just happened to mention, oh, by the way, we had Americans in Tehran to scout out the situation.
Oh
Unfortunately,
my
those
gosh.
Americans were still there.
Oh my gosh. What in the world were they thinking? Wow.
Yeah.
So my gosh. So did those guys, did they get out on their own, or was there? I mean, were they in personal danger once that information came out?
Well, they were definitely in personal danger. Luckily, the Iranians did not know who they were. Fred, the Iranian guy, simply disappeared. I mean, he told everyone, they said, I cannot go out with you by commercial air. I'm going to have to find another way. He disappeared into the countryside, actually met
Oh.
with some of his family. That's another story.
Hmm.
The 3 other guys, one traveling, well, all 3 of them were traveling on European passports, had to find their own way out. And one of the guys said, we got to get out of here as fast as possible. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, better trained heads prevailed, and they said, no, we can't try to run. We have to go slowly, methodically. So they waited for several days and then they rebooked themselves on a different flight and got out safely several days later. So
Wow.
that was the end of it right there. Fred showed up back in the real world. He showed up about 3 weeks later, having found his own way out.
My gosh. I'm trying to imagine the tension that must have been present for that several days of having to be patient, knowing it's the right move, but not having many options available to you at the time. But they obviously kind of steeled themselves to it and made it through with cool heads.
Yeah, you have to deal with what you have with a cool head. That's definitely true.
Hmm. So the second rescue mission, would it have differed substantially from the first one? I mean, the distances are the same, the threat is mostly the same, that sort of thing. But were they going to take a new plot, or just kind of fix the issues, the logistical issues with the helicopters and that sort of thing?
Well, the issues with the helicopters was resolved by basically disinviting the Navy and the Marine Corps from the operation.
Wow.
The Navy helicopters were determined not to be suitable for the operation, so the Air Force was invited back in like they should have been at the beginning, and it became an all Army, all Air Force operation. So I like to say that it went from being a rescue operation to a retribution operation because the whole concept changed. The assault was still going to be the same. Take down the American embassy, release the hostages, take down the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and get the three hostages there. The difference was the ratio of forces. Charlie Beckwith's force went up to about 150 men, and Detachment A's size of the force went from 9 to 35. And the delivery into the city was going to be different too. We weren't going to be using trucks this time, we were going to be using helicopters.
Hmm.
Beckwith's troops would have been delivered into the embassy by Black Hawk, and Detachment A's force would have been delivered into the embassy foreign ministry by Little Bird OH-6s.
Wow. Wow. My gosh. So what's the reason that that second mission never went forward then?
There is some well, two things. We knew where the people in the foreign ministry were. We knew they were still there. Some of the American hostages from the embassy had been moved out when the Iranians found out about the first raid, and we were never quite sure that they had been fully moved back into the embassy. Towards the end, about November or December of 1980, we were pretty certain that they were all back in the embassy. But
Hmm.
two other things happened. Jack Anderson, a correspondent at the time, gave a news report that said he had heard that a second rescue attempt was going to be made. That was one strike against it. And then Ronald Reagan was elected president, and there are rumors that the Reagan administration had some backdoor dealings, backroom dealings with the Iranians, saying that if you release our hostages after Reagan becomes president, we will deliver parts for your aging American airplanes.
Hmm.
The
Wow.
truth of that
Okay.
matter is, I cannot, I cannot substantiate that, but there's been enough reporting on it that it makes a very large question.
Hmm. Man. Okay. I see. I see. Whereas, do you think that the hostages by this point were turning into quite a football for the Iranian government that time? Like maybe it would be better for them in many ways if they could divest themselves of those hostages peacefully.
Yeah, especially if they could get something for
Yeah,
them.
yeah, clearly. And
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the aviation parts that you mentioned, but I do know that they flew those American aircraft for many, many, many years after that. So it certainly makes sense that they would have a parts
Well,
stockpile on hand.
they had a lot of F4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats. If you've seen the latest Tom Cruise movie, I think it alludes to that. But
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
and they need parts for them because those aircrafts have to be maintained like nobody knows.
Yep, yep, I can imagine. Okay. Yeah, I had not heard that part before. It certainly makes sense that you're not going to get something for nothing. And I always wondered why it was that the hostages were released, what it was like 5 minutes after he took the oath of office or
Exactly.
something like
That
that.
makes it a bit strange. Yeah.
Yeah, in my younger days, in my naivete, I assumed that they thought that, Reagan's a cowboy and he means business and they don't want to mess with him. But, shows what I knew back then anyway.
Yeah, as we see from history, I don't think any administration is completely clean of underhanded dealings
Right.
or necessary backroom dealings, as the case may be.
Hmm. Yeah, understandable. I mean, it's dirty politics kind of, but the hostages did come home, which is, it's hard to argue against that, honestly. So what happened to the members of Det A after all of this? Did they just go back to business as usual, or should I say duty as normal after the second mission was scrubbed?
Well, Yeah, at the time we were in Florida when we were told to go home early December, and we were told that the mission was scrubbed at least for the moment, and that we should go home and wait. So we did. We flew back to Berlin and then sat around and watched the politics in Washington until the hostages were released in January. So at that
Hmm.
point, we knew it was all up. As one of our guys said, I think quoting somebody from a Star Trek movie, he said, "It would have been glorious." But there you have it.
Man, yeah, it's hard to imagine what that would have been like truly had it gone forward. Had either one of them gone forward, certainly, but no way to know. So, James, I understand that this mission it led to some major changes throughout all of the military special operations community. Did any of that affect Det A or at your level at that time? Did you see any like sweeping changes in the next year or two because of all this?
It actually took a little bit longer, but yeah, the Goldwater-Nichols Act was passed, which basically set up United States Special Operations Command, which was a separate entity to control special operations. For good or bad, it managed to consolidate things in the spec ops community so that their planning was done basically as one entity rather than as four services, because there
Hmm.
was a lot of competition between the Marines, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army about who was going to do what. That was why all four services were included on the first raid. But the Goldwater's Nichols Act took a lot of that out of and put it right. Some people will question its efficacy, whether or not it's become too large and too bloated. I'm not going to try to address that here, but it definitely made things different. More money, special operations was looked at as a stepchild by the services, and US SOCOM changed all that. And you can see how that resulted in changes since 9/11, especially.
Mm.
For the
Yeah.
unit, though, it had some effect because of news leaks. Detachment A was basically outed as a special forces unit. It had a reasonably good cover before that. But the fact that it was out in the news made the commander of US forces in Europe concerned. And he came down to the unit and said, "You have an operational security problem." And he was right. So that led to changes in the unit. Detachment A was eventually closed down in 1984, but it was replaced by a sister unit in the same city that had a more effective cover. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what Detachment A, and it completely separated the unit off from all the issues that Detachment A had before.
Hmm.
So Detachment A went away 1984, and a new unit came into play in 1984 as well, and it took over the mission, the same mission, counterterrorism and the stay behind mission against the Russians, and it stayed in place until the reunification of Germany in 1990.
Right. I think you went into a lot more detail about all of this in your first book, right? Special Forces Berlin.
Yeah, that tells the whole history.
Okay, gotcha. Great. Wow. Well, what a mission, and it really is an incredible story. And I don't know if it's been put together as thoroughly and completely anywhere else until now. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to read more about it, James. For those of you who want to read the book, of course, we have not covered anywhere near in the level of detail that James wrote about in Mission Iran. It's available now after you're listening to this episode. You can go ahead and pick it up from Amazon or elsewhere. And James has quite a few books available as well, including Special Forces Berlin, like we just mentioned, and his series of novels as well, which very helpfully do not have to be cleared for publication. Don't take a year to get published anyway.
Actually,
So
that's not
lots of very.
true, Justin.
Oh no! Oh my
Everything I
gosh!
write has to be cleared. That's the problem.
Really?
My novels don't take as much time. Gratefully, instead of taking a year, they usually take about a month. But I
Ah,
also, you mentioned my novels. I'm gonna stick my neck out here and say there is one of my novels that deals with Iran in a fictional sort of way, but I draw heavily on my experiences, and it's called Appointment in Tehran. So if you enjoy novels more than you do nonfiction, I would suggest you pick that one up. As Justin mentioned, I have an email address. I think we're going to put it in the end of this. And if you're interested in any of my books, perhaps signed by the author, then contact me and we can go from there.
Oh wow, fantastic! Yeah, yeah. I hope that's a great opportunity to get one of your books directly from you. So, all right, sounds good. So make sure to check the show notes of this episode if you'd like to get one of James's books directly from him. James, so now that this one has been published, do you have another book, maybe another in your novel series, or something else you're going to be working on after this?
My wife hates you for asking that question.
Uh
I have right now. I've got 3 novels in the works, and I've got
oh. Oh
two
wow.
nonfiction books. One of them I just completed a reconnaissance trip for. That's going to be about the Cold War city of Berlin in words and pictures. So that's going to be a nonfiction, and I'm going to talk about all the different spy agencies that worked in the city.
Hmm. Okay, that sounds fantastic, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because just a few weeks ago, I had an interview with and I read a new book by Vince Houghton called "Covert City" about Miami and the incredible impact that the Cold War had on Miami. Of course, right there across the water from Cuba, and that was really interesting. And I love to see the way that economies and culture and all of that can develop around these like national security issues and organizations and all that. So I'm very excited about that idea because Berlin is certainly an endless topic of discussion here on the podcast and endlessly fascinating for me as well.
It was an amazing place to be. It still is amazing, but it's not quite the spy city it was. But it's a fun place to go visit, and I'm hoping that if you have my book, you'll be even more entertained when you go there.
I certainly hope so as well. Well, good. I'm looking forward to that. Do you have an estimated publication date, like later this year or in 2025, something like
It's
that?
going to be probably spring of 2025,
Okay, that's only 9 months away or so. That's great. Well,
hopefully.
fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate it, James. Please keep me apprised of all of that, and I will let the listeners and the readers know as well because I love your work, honestly.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to talk to people. I love telling the history of the units.
Fantastic. So, besides your email address that you mentioned, do you have like a website or any social media profiles, anything like that that you want to share for people to kind of publicly follow along?
If you post my name in Google or whatever search site you're using, James Stejskal, if you get the spelling right, I will show up on Facebook. What are we calling Twitter this week? Instagram.
Yeah.
And I do have a website also. It's kind of lame, but I do have one.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah, we'll put those together in the show notes as well, so people can find you more easily.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. It's been a great talk as always, and I look forward to your future work as well.
Thank you, Justin. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Always welcome. Take care.
Bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.